Hi there folks, welcome back to the farm. Today we're back in the Ford Explorer and we're taking a look at something that's been causing my wife some trouble for a little while. This 2014 Explorer still has the same strut, coils, and top hat that it came with from the factory, and they've nearly completely worn out. This is causing a lot of extra noise coming from the wheel wells, including when you turn. The top hat doesn't turn smoothly, so it makes a clunk, clunk, clunk noise when you turn the wheel. And you get a lot of wobble and extra bounce from the shock because the shock's not absorbing those movements in the wheel. So what we're going to do is we're going to swap out the strut assembly for both sides today, and I'm going to show you what we're going to need to get that done. Now, to fix that strut that's gone bad and that noisy top hat on the passenger side, we're just going to switch out the entire strut assembly today. When you switch out suspension components, what you want to do is do them in pairs. That way your vehicle is performing the same on both sides and remains balanced. So what we've got today is we've got the driver's side and passenger side strut assemblies with new springs and new top hats installed. This job seems in depth. It's definitely a lot more steps than, say, replacing a purge solenoid or an oil change, but it's not something you can't just do in your driveway. What you want to do is be prepared. You're going to want to make sure you have a full set of sockets. I've got my 3/8 and my 1/2 inch out. It's a good job for an impact gun. I don't have an impact gun. I've just got this electric screwdriver to help me with some of the longer bolts. Suspension bolts can be pretty tight, and because they're always exposed to the elements, dirt, water, they can sometimes get rusty. So I also recommend having some penetrating oil nearby. Here I have some liquid wrench that I'm going to spray all the bolts down with so that penetrating oil sucks in and not breaking off anything when I go in. You also want to make sure you've got your wrenches nearby, because you're going to be using your wrenches along with your ratchets to get some of the nuts and bolts off. And I have a little piece of pipe here that I use like a cheater bar on some of the more stubborn bolts. All right, that's all we need to get this done, so let's jump into it. Now, to get at what we're working at today, we're gonna have to take these tires off. So before we jack up the car, what we want to do is loosen these lug bolts. So before we get this jacked up, we're gonna loosen all these lug nuts just a little bit. We'll do the same thing on the other side, then we'll jack it up and take the tire the rest of the way off. All right, now that we've got the lug nuts loosened on each of the tires, we're gonna start by jack up the car. There's a cross member just behind this front bumper that I'm gonna line up my jack with so I can lift up the front of the car, and then once I have the front of the car in the air, I can sneak my jack stands underneath the sides. There's two frame rails that go just all along the length of the car, and I can put those jack stands just under the back of the tires. That's going to give me plenty of room to work on the suspension components I'm working on today without the jack stands being in the way. It's one of the things you want to think about when you're jacking up your vehicle. You want to think about safety, and you want to think about your working envelope, making sure you have enough room around you to work on the car, but at the same time make sure that your car is jacked up safely. So to do that today, we're going to jack it up on the cross member, put the jack stands under the frame rails, and then also put the tires under the frame rails. That way, if something does fall, the car rocks off the jack stand somehow, it doesn't land directly on me or the ground. It first lands on those tires, and I have enough room to wiggle out or get help. All right, let's get this thing jacked up. I will slide this tire off. And put it under the front bumper. Okay, we've let it down. All right, let's get to work. All right, the next few steps are the same for both sides. So what we're gonna do first is we're going to hit all of the nuts and bolts that we're working on today with some of that PB blaster, or some of that liquid wrench, penetrating oil, to help me loosen them up. So I'm working on a couple of things today, but this is the same for any bolt. What you want to do is take your penetrating oil and just spray down the friction surfaces of the bolts you're going to be working on. So I'm taking off the strut, so I've got the 2 knuckle bolts, I've got the support up here, and I've got the brake caliper I have to take off. I've also got the nuts and bolts back here for the lower control arm bushings. Okay, we'll get those nice and soaked. That one too. All right. So that'll be the same for the other side. All right, next thing we're going to do is we're going to get back behind our brake caliper here and take off these 2 bolts that hold the brake caliper on. Now these bolts can be kind of tight, so one trick I use is that cheater bar that I showed you earlier. I slide it over the end of my wrench, get my socket on the bolt head, and then use that for a little bit of extra leverage. I press gently, and I'm really just trying to get a little bit of movement out of it. I don't want to get it all at once, but if I can get it moving, there we go. There we go. And it's loose. So that's one reason we use the penetrating oil. That's one reason we use the penetrating oil and the cheater bar, is because these suspension bolts are going to be very tight. So I'm going to pull these the rest of the way out, and then I'll show you what to do with the brake caliper. We've got those 2 bolts out of there, and now what we want to do is wiggle this caliper off and place it to the side. Now this rubber hose, we don't want to stretch it, so what we're going to do is we're going to wiggle this off and put it right here on top of the tire that we've placed underneath the front fender. So let's give this a little wiggle. There we go, comes right loose. Check out your brake pads. We just replaced these, so they look really good. And there we go, we got the brake caliper off, and now we can get to the 2 bottom bolts here and the top bolt here. Now before we go take this whole thing apart, we're going to release a couple of these other little sensors. So here we have the speed sensor. We just want to get that loose, and it attaches down here too, so we'll wiggle that out. Alright, and once we get that sensor out of the way, we can start on these 2 bigger bolts. Now with the sensor cable out of the way, it's been pulled out of here and just pushed off to the side, we can start working on the 3 big bolts. There's one here behind the brake rotor, one here just above the brake rotor, and then one up here. So we're going to go ahead and see if we can't get a socket on this bottom one, but we'll probably have to get a wrench on this top one. So to do this, I'm going to put a wrench on the back side, on the nut, and then on the front side, on the bolt, I'll get the big socket. This one's a 21. We'll get the big 3/4 inch on there, or the big 1/2 inch drive on there. See if we can't get it off, but there's a good chance, yep, we're going to need the cheater bar. So we'll get our cheater bar on the end of this for a little extra leverage, hold it in there, and give it a little gentle push. Those nuts, they were a bear, but let me tell you, they came off. Just had to break the initial tension. There's some Loctite that was put in there last time these were replaced. That's just good practice. We're actually going to Loctite these too. Unfortunately, it looks like there's a lot of red Loctite used, which is the highest strength Loctite. We're going to use blue Loctite today because it's going to make it easier for it to come off, but it'll still keep the bolts from vibrating loose. So anyway, now that we've got the nut loose, I took it off to the very end. Now I do that because I'm going to be using a rubber mallet to help drive this out. I find a good first step when you're going to drive out a nut is to first release the tension by getting on the bolt and twisting it one way or the other. I've already done this bolt, but there was a lot of tension built up through the bolt hole, and breaking that tension makes it easier to drive the nut out. So now that I've got the bolt loose enough to where it'll rotate, I know that it's not stuck in there. I put the nut on the end, just to the end of the thread. You can see this bolt here doesn't have thread on the very end, and it's rounded on the inside, so it's meant to be driven out with an air hammer. If you have one, that makes this job a lot easier. But if you don't, you can take the nut, put it right on the very end, take a rubber mallet, and then drive it out. Alright, so now I'm going to take the nut off the rest of the way, drive the bolt the rest of the way out, and there we go, that's one bolt out. We're going to do the same thing to the one on bottom. Alright, now that I got those big bolts out, the next thing I got to do is take off the sway bar end link and the tie rod end. That's going to allow the whole lower control arm to come loose. So I'm going to do that now. That sway bar end link is up here, and the tie rod end is down here behind the rotor. So the next thing we need to do is take off this sway bar end link right here. Now this is kind of a trick, because if you just go and try to wrench on this nut, what it'll do is it'll turn the entire sway bar end link, because this back here is a ball joint. So what you need to do is you actually need to put a wrench on the big nut like this, and then get your ratchet on the little hex head on the end of the bolt. So I gotta get my hex head on like this, and I'm going to try to wedge the wrench against the bottom of the spring housing. So we'll get my cheater bar back in there again and see if we can't get this loose. So now we're on the top. Only thing left holding this strut up is these 4 nuts that tie into the top of the strut assembly. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to take each of these 4 nuts off. Now at this point, these 4 nuts are the only thing holding the strut up. So as we loosen them, we just want to be cautious of where the strut is underneath so that we can catch it once we pull these nuts all the way out. And that wasn't so hard. So we'll get all of these finger loose, and then we'll take them off the rest of the way by hand. And now they've got those nuts loosened up on top, we can take the last couple off the rest of the way. And one more little bit. And just pull that puppy out. Alright, there you go. The whole strut and shock assembly has been removed. So we'll put this one to the side and put the new one in the reverse order. Now here we have the new strut assembly that's going to go in. The first thing I did was I compared it to the old strut. It is the same. It's got the same mounting location, same holes and everything. So what we're going to do is we're going to push it up in there. Line it up with the holes on top. So what I did is I got the strut up into the strut mount on top, and I've got a couple of the old nuts in there, just a little bit to hold it in place. Because what I want to do first is I want to attach the knuckle. I want to attach the knuckle and the sway bar end link before I really tighten down the top. So I'm going to do that now. Let's start with the sway bar end link. We'll just do everything in reverse order that it was installed. Once you got the strut in place, you're pretty much almost done. The next thing you want to do is go back through and tighten up all the big bolts, like the sway arm link bolt we took out, the 2 bolts on the knuckle, and then put the bolts into the top. Those bigger bolts are harder to get in place, so going back and tightening up that sway bar end link and the 2 knuckles is going to be easier, and then lastly you can go and tighten up those nuts on top. Now I use some medium strength thread locker. That just helps make it so those nuts and bolts don't vibrate out. Some of the bolts had high strength thread locker from the factory on them, so I just put on the medium strength because I torqued them down and I wanted to make sure that I could get them off again later. After I got the top nuts tightened up, I tightened up the caliper bolts to get the caliper back on the rotor, and then it was time to get the tire on. Get the tire on, just the opposite of getting it off. Pull it out from the front of the bumper, put it on the hub, and then tighten down each of the nuts by hand before lowering it, and then torquing those nuts down the rest of the way on the ground once again so the wheel's not spinning as you're tightening them. So we ran out of time, that's why we weren't able to finish to do the entire video out in the driveway. It's a couple of days later. So what I've been able to do is get the struts on, and then once the struts were on, I went ahead and took it and got an alignment done. I did some other work at the same time. I did a lot of things that could have potentially put it out of alignment, so I went ahead and took it to my alignment shop. They did a great job. Not a lot had changed, but there was a little bit of toe on the back and the front that they were able to take out, and now it drives straight. We've got some great results as far as the sound and the stuttering that we saw earlier in the video. We'll take a look at that now so you can see the before and after. In the after shot, you can see how much more smooth it is. It doesn't make that noise anymore, which is great because now when we're turning to get out of the driveway, we're not getting those clunks when we're driving around. Anyway, I stand by this one. I think the struts and strut replacement is a very easy job, very straightforward, and honestly, the ride and the performance of the car has increased a ton, as well as taking that noise out of the passenger side. So this was a great project. It was a lot of fun. It's always fun to get your hands dirty, play with some nuts and bolts, and I highly recommend anybody can do this themselves. Just make sure you get it aligned afterwards, so if you made any changes to your steering geometry, the alignment shop will make sure that you're still running true, so you're not running through tires and your car is still safe. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you found it helpful. Please subscribe to my channel for other videos about do-it-yourself, car maintenance, home repairs, all those things we do here on the Hayseed Farm channel. And if you have a comment, leave a comment below. Like the video, please. I really appreciate that. And thanks again for watching. See y'all later. Bye now.